Welcome. I am Elise Lieberman, and it is my pleasure as director of the Toby Center for Jewish Life and Learning to welcome you to the second edition of TJHTalks in cooperation with the Warsaw Jewish Film Festival. We are pleased that our cooperation with the festival continues to grow and become more fruitful, and we wish our colleagues much success during this week of films that are being shown throughout the city here in Warsaw. Our program, as usual, will be approximately 60 minutes. The 45-minute conversation between our guests will last approximately 45 minutes, and there will be about 15 minutes for questions and answers from you, which please feel free to add in the comment section questions where you are at the moment or any thoughts you would like to share with our guest speakers. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guests, our friends. Glenn Kurtz is a 2019-2021 Presidential Fellow at Chapman University in Orange, California, and the recipient of many distinguished fellowships and has published widely. He is the author of 3 Minutes in Poland, Discovering a Lost World in a 1938 Family Film, which was named a Best Book of 2014 by The New Yorker, the Boston Globe, and National Public Radio. His book is the foundation on which the soon-to-be-released film, 3 Minutes, a Lengthening, is based. Roberta Grossman is an internationally acclaimed writer, director, producer, and member of the Academy's documentary branch. Her credits include, among others, Blessed is the Match, The Life and Death of Chana Senesh, Hava Nagila the Movie, and the widely acclaimed 2018 film, Who Will Write Our History, with Nancy Spielberg as the executive producer. In 2020, Roberta received the Toby Philanthropies Jewish People Award for her contributions to Jewish culture and heritage. Roberta, we're honored to have you. It's a delight to have you with us here again, and the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Elise. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today and to have an opportunity to talk with Glenn. Hi, Glenn.
Hi, Roberta. It's great to see you. And Elise, thank you so much for this invitation and to the Warsaw Jewish Film Festival. It's an honor to be here.
I want to start, Glenn, just right at the beginning. Over a decade ago, you found something, a buried treasure amongst your family's belongings. Can you just walk us through that discovery, how you discovered it, when you realized what you were holding in your hands, and maybe a little bit about how your awareness of what you were holding in your hands changed over time?
Sure. Yeah, I was at my parents' place in Florida, and I was rooting around in the closet, as one does, and I came across a box of old home movies that we had preserved, or that they had preserved. They were in terrible condition, and it was, vacation footage, my parents' wedding, things like that. But among these was a film of my grandparents on vacation in 1938, and when you start playing the film, it was in such poor condition it couldn't be played, and we didn't have a projector, but it had been transferred to VHS sometime in the 1980s. So we watched it again on VHS, and there's a title that says Our Trip to Holland, Belgium, Poland, Switzerland, France, and England, 1938. And, I guess maybe we had seen this as kids. I had this recollection that we had this film, but I had never thought about it or looked at it as an adult. And seeing it in 2009, I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know anything about the trip. I didn't know anything about my grandparents' travels. But just seeing Poland and 1938 in the same sentence told me that this was something of tremendous importance. And then when you look at the film, there's hundreds of people in it. A lot of children sort of mugging for the camera and trying to get the lens on them. And the instant I watched it, there's nothing bad that happens in the film. It's actually quite charming. But we know something that they don't know. And the instant that I watched it, I felt this tremendous sense of responsibility that very likely this is the only moving imagery of these people 1 year before the German invasion, 1 year before the war starts. And so it seemed to me that their memory had somehow become my responsibility. So yeah, I felt a profound urgency to try and understand what I was looking at, what the film was showing. I didn't even know what town it was when I first found it, but I wanted immediately to be able to identify these people. I wanted to know who they were, how they came to be, where they were, how they came to be in this footage, and what had happened to them, of course.
So after that initial shock of recognition, what were your next steps to taking the film from sort of a neglected family heirloom, not even an heirloom the way it was, well, it was preserved along with other precious memories. But how did you take it from being something that, you know, was part of your family or belonged to your family to something that became part of the world?
Well, the first and most important thing was I donated it to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. As I mentioned, when I found it, it was in such poor condition it couldn't be projected, but they gave it to a preservation studio, Color Lab, which they work with, and they were able to preserve the footage and to make an archival print that was possible now to examine with great detail. So while that was happening, of course, I asked my family, where is it? And, you know, what information did we have? And my aunt and my father were unanimous in saying that it was my grandmother's hometown. So my sister is a genealogical wizard, and we had found that town, and we knew some survivor from that town. So we showed the film to him, and within a second, he said, I've never seen this place before in my life. So imagine that. The family story turned out to be wrong. But that left me kind of at a dead end. And the next thing I thought was, well, you know, if it's not my grandmother's hometown, maybe it's my grandfather's hometown. And so I started searching. I was unable to find a survivor from that town who was able to say anything about it. I did find a woman, but she was so young when the war began and so traumatized by her survival that she really couldn't focus on the film and couldn't tell me, she couldn't even identify it as the town. But I went to archives and I searched and I tried to learn everything that I could about that town. And ultimately, at the Ghetto Fighters House Museum in Israel, in their photo archive, I found a photograph that very clearly stated the Nasielsk synagogue doors. It shows a picture of the doors of this synagogue. And it happens that there's an image of these doors in the film. So it was from that I was able to determine with certainty that the town in the film is my grandfather's hometown of Nasielsk, about 35 miles north of Warsaw.
Should we take a look at it now that you've set it up? Let's share this 3 minutes in Poland with the people who are here with us today.
I'll comment a little bit, though I think it's best to just watch it. Of course, it's silent, so there's no information that the film provides other than what's in the imagery. And you see the excitement of the kids in town when Americans show up, especially with a movie camera.
Yeah, this happens all over the world. Wherever you go with the camera, kids show up. There seems to be something like a communal event going on. Is there something going on inside?
Sure. Well, this is the image you can see on the upper left. There's a carved lion on the door, and that was the image that was in the photograph that allowed me to identify the town. Yeah, clearly there's a large gathering in what is the synagogue here. And, you know, it's impossible for us to know exactly what it was, but my suspicion was that, well, the Americans had shown up and very likely made some kind of a donation. And so perhaps there was a special service in their honor. The other really remarkable thing about the film here is that almost 2/3 of it are in color.
Being in color really changes the perception. It goes from something far away long ago to something not so far away and not so long ago.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Although the images are just as sharp in some of the black and white, there's a vividness to the color sections. And that bow, the red bow and the girl's hair there, it just, it makes it feel like you're right there.
I don't know if you saw, Glenn, the footage from World War One. There was a movie, a documentary that was, you first see part of it in black and white, and then you see it in color.
Yeah, this is the Peter Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
They will not grow old.
Do you know anything about the size of the town?
Sure. At the time, Nasielsk had approximately 5,000 residents. There was a sort of farming community surrounding it, so maybe 7,000 in the greater metropolitan area, but it was a very small town. But of that, 3,000 were Jews, so it was at least 50%, or almost 50% of the population was Jewish. That's my grandmother and three of their friends. The woman with the hat, the floral hat that just walked down the steps.
Who's this little girl? She's so cute.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea?
I don't. And the mama who's shoving people off the steps.
Yeah.
That's it. It's just 3 minutes long, and it's very, very amateur footage. My grandfather had just bought the camera, and he wasn't, I mean, I think it was a novelty for him as well. And yeah, as I say, nothing bad happens in it. But the minute I saw these faces, I thought, well, I'm responsible for their memory.
So as it turns out, this is not the only footage that was shot by travelers going back to the old country to visit family in 38 and 39. Have you encountered some of the other footage that was shot in a similar way that's at Yivo, at Brandeis, and that?
Sure. Yeah, one of the things that I did when I found the film was to search for other home movies from the same era and see if there was something about this film that I could learn from those. So as you mentioned, Yivo has a marvelous collection of home movies, typically from Americans who were either immigrants themselves or immediate descendants of immigrants who went back to the old country in the interwar years. And there are quite a number. They're in many ways generically similar. There's lots of kids who show up in front of the camera. One of the things that I did learn from looking at those was that there's a big difference between people who went to see someone, right, who went to visit their family, and people who were just going to look. And in many ways, my grandfather's film seems to me, although he's clearly, accepted by the community, right? People are excited to see him. They're not standing off. But at the same time, the imagery doesn't really indicate that he's going to see specific people. There's a couple of those indoor scenes where it seems possible they might be visiting someone that they knew. And I believe that some of their traveling companions knew people in town. And then I have some documentation that would prove that later. Subsequently, someone emigrated a few months after their trip, sponsored by my grandparents' friends. So they certainly had some connections there. But yeah, ultimately, I was on my own in trying to determine what was happening in this film. But it does exist within a context of other family films. Just the color is very unusual.
At what point did you decide to turn this into a book? And was the book a way to allow you the time and the focus to learn about who the people were and learn everything you could about the town?
Well, I knew right away that I wanted to write something about it. It seemed to me such an extraordinary document. And for 2 years, I researched it. But because I was unable to find a survivor at the time, someone who could help me understand what I was looking at, there's a limit to what you can do. I mean, I found a lot of documentation. I was able to find a lot of names of people who lived in the town, from the business directory, from the Landsmannschaften correspondence in the Yivo archive, among other places, from the Joint Distribution Committee. So I was able to find the names of a lot of people. But to go from names on a list to faces in a film, it's an unbridgeable gap unless you have someone who can be your guide across that bridge. So after 2 years, I kind of had given up almost. I thought, well, this is an amazing piece of evidence and we'll never know what it's evidence of because I just found it too late. And then something amazing happened to change it all. So for those first 2 years, I wanted to write something about it, but I simply didn't think that I had enough material for a book. And then, then something happened that changed everything.
Okay, do you want to tell us what happened, or do you want to start by looking at the 35 seconds of footage?
Oh, sure. Let's see those 35 seconds of footage. And I'll narrate.
Here are these two people.
Oh, nope, not this one. Better pictures of the white
The
here.
one that's black and white.
The one that's black and white.
Yeah, it's a 35-second clip.
Yep,
There.
here we. Oh, this is starting the film over again, I think. Okay, well, it will come soon enough, and I'll just talk over it. So, as I mentioned, I had donated the original footage to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and they were able to preserve it and digitize it, and they put it on their website. And when I had finally identified the correct town, it was identified there on the website as that town. And 2 years after I donated it, I got an email from someone kind of out of the blue who was watching this scene, and right there, oops, stop. Go back.
Go back about.
There we go.
Thank you.
Yeah, she recognized. I think the fact that it ran past this image is really significant. He's this young man here on the lower left of the screen is on camera for literally a split second, but this woman had recognized him as her grandfather, as a 13-year-old boy. And he's still alive. As a matter of fact, yesterday was his 97th birthday.
Wow.
And well, his name, he was born Moshek Tuchendler in 1924 in Nasielsk. He now goes by the name of Maurice Chandler in the United States. But he has a photographic memory. He's an extraordinary, extraordinary man, and was the sole survivor of his family. But when I showed him the film, I spoke with him. You know, I got this email like, oh, it's my grandfather, we're so happy. And I'm like, oh my God, this is what I've been searching for. And so, of course, I spoke with him literally seconds after he had seen the film. And the first thing he said to me was, you've given me back my childhood, right? I think for someone who has suffered this trauma, what happens before seems almost, you know, like a fantasy, like it didn't really happen. But he recognized people in the film. He was able to identify people by name. He was able to tell stories about them and about other people who were important to him and his family, but who don't happen to appear in the film. And just an extraordinary wealth of information. We've been talking for 10 years now, and I still learn from him every time we talk. So with that kind of information, it became possible to tell the kind of story I had dreamed of, which was with the degree of specificity that film itself already has, right? Film always shows particular people in a particular place, in a particular time. They're wearing particular things, they make particular gestures. But unless you know what you're looking at, it becomes very general. Oh, you know, children crowding around a camera in interwar Poland. I wanted to be able to be as specific as the film was. And the information that Mr. Chandler gave me was enough. And from his recollections and from a great deal of research, I was able ultimately to find 7 other survivors still living in 2012 when I met Mr. Chandler for the first time, including another woman who appears in the film as a young person. So with that kind of success and the sort of miraculous connections, it became possible to start piecing together fragments of the town's history, these people's personal history, and then also what really was going on in the film.
Has gone on. Oh, do you feel that as time has gone on, the space between 1945 and today, that there's been, well, I feel this way, that there's been waves of research and consciousness, so that the first task of historians, filmmakers, and survivors was to talk about what happened between 39 and 45. And then it's only later that really what happened before 39, 39 for Poland, later for other places, began to be a focus of information. And I really love the fact that this footage and your book and what will come next focuses on how people lived, not on how they died.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the phrase that you used, what happened, it's such a rich and ambiguous phrase, because what happened between 39 and 45, well, how do you even frame that question? And I think in the first wave of historiography, that was, let's talk institutionally, let's talk sort of in the largest scale about what happened in the Holocaust.
Right.
And, you know, now there's probably been 2 or 3 waves since then. And I think that there's a wave now of looking at it in a much more personal way about what happened to individuals
Right.
During this time. And, you know, one thing that I often say is that, you know, for the first 50 years, we thought there was a Holocaust of 6 million people. And now I think that there were 6 million Holocausts.
Right.
Each person has a distinctive story. And it's often the grandchildren, for one reason or another, who are the ones who begin to pursue those questions. And then now I think you're right, we're entering yet another phase in which we're thinking, well, wait, you know, this period was the end of a profound and long and deep integrated history of the Jewish community in Poland. Why are we focusing only on these few years? There was so much that went on before. And one of the things when I first found the film that I was honestly grateful for was that it was a before the Holocaust film, right? That it showed people at home in a community where they felt comfortable and confident and where they, you know, had lives that they were invested in and planned to live, and they were not yet victims. They were not yet Holocaust survivors.
Right, right. Well, speaking of Holocaust survivors, do you want to now take a look at the color footage with the survivor from the town who you had a good
Sure. Yeah, this is a brief clip of them coming. An interview with Mr. Chandler as he's identifying 2 people who appear in the film.
Okay, here are these 2 people.
And we have better pictures of them coming up later.
Yes,
but
yes.
The man with the white beard.
Yeah, the man with the white beard, I think he was sort of the, what they called the ascetic person. His name, everybody knew him by one name. His name was Cheskia. Cheskia is a biblical from the Tanakh. Nobody knew what he lived of. But he was dressed just like that, with that beard, and everybody fed him. He would walk into everybody's house. I remember he used to eat chopped liver with strong onions, and you knew he was coming. You know, black bread, this and that, very simple life. And everybody thought he was, you know, the Jewish version of sainthood.
Yeah. Like a mystic?
Heskia. He would go from different houses, like the Bornsteins, when we used to be there. He would come up and he told stories from the past and so on, and then he'd leave. Nobody knew where he slept, probably in a shul or something. He was that type of a character. Now, the shorter men,
With the black beard.
yeah, his name is Chamnusen Zweighaft, and he was the one they called him the Matzaiva Kritzer. He was the one that chiseled all the headstones for the cemetery.
Wow. Amazing memory. I mean, I don't think I will remember, you know, if pressed, I'm not sure I'll remember my own name in the next 30 seconds, alone the guy who carved the headstone. So that's quite, oh, there they are. Okay.
Yeah, these are the 2 men he was talking about, the Heskia with the white beard in the center and Chamnusen Zweighaft with the black beard in the left.
That's great. If you, Glenn, just sort of, if you could talk to other people in the clip that we saw, is there anybody in particular who you would like to talk to? Know what's going on with you, or who are you, or?
Well, I'd like to talk to all of them, of course, and I'd very much like to talk to my grandfather about why he was there. I never met him; he died before I was born, and what it meant to him to be there. There were a number of other people in the film whose faces, for whatever reason, sort of stand out to me. There's the girl who actually gets shoved by the bully. She shows up in a lot of the frames of the film. She's one of the people who appears most frequently. And I remembered seeing her in this film from when I was a kid. If there was anything that I remembered of the film, it was like, oh, there was that girl. I don't know why. There was something about her that felt familiar or felt related. I don't know. I'd love to talk with her. There's a man who lived in the town who who is not in the film, but who subsequently became very important in this story because everybody remembered him, Fischl Perlmutter, who was both an artist and a photographer. He was the town photographer. And almost all of the survivors and descendants who have, this one photograph of their family taken in the studio sometime in the 20s or 30s, that photograph was taken by Fischl Perlmutter. He also was an artist who had painted murals on the walls of the synagogue, which everyone remembered and thought were among the most beautiful things they'd ever seen. And it's poignant that in the day of the deportation, which was December 3rd, 1939, just 3 months after the beginning of the war, the Jews were expelled from this town, and the Germans confined a large segment of the population in the synagogue overnight. And one of the things was they were forced to scrape these murals off the walls with their fingernails. So I'd very much like to talk to Fischl Perlmutter, if that were possible. He would, because everybody came through his studio, he would know everybody in town and know what was going on in town. And I feel like he would have been someone who could have told us about what the cultural life of the town was with a kind of detail and depth that only someone who had, or maybe the cafe owner would know from overhearing people's conversations. But I think he would be wonderful to talk to.
What you were just saying, what you said previously about not 6 million people perished in the Holocaust, but there were 6 million Holocausts. The story about having to scrape off the beloved mural in the synagogue is something I've never heard before, and it's quite brutal.
Yeah.
Quite brutal.
Yeah, that was a recollection from Mr. Chandler's mother, who, so Mr. Chandler actually fled to the Russian side, the Russian zone, shortly after the Germans arrived, and the Russians arrived, and they divided Poland between them. He then came back, because he was with his brother, who didn't think that he could survive as a refugee in Bialystok. But by that time, so he missed the deportation in Nasielsk, but his parents had been deported, and they rendezvoused again in Warsaw, and she told him that story of the deportation. There's also, in the Ringelblum archive, an eyewitness account from from someone from Seratsk, who's a town not far from Nasielsk. They were also marched to the synagogue the day after the Nasielsk Jewish population was deported. And there's a description then of what the synagogue looked like, which is completely desecrated and destroyed.
Wow. Do you know what happened to most of the Jews from that town?
Yeah, they were, as I said, deported on December 3rd, 1939. The train dropped them off in the center, what would become the general government in Poland, in Lukov, and another town, the name of which I'm going to mangle, Mizrich, in Yiddish, and the Polish pronunciation I won't even try. But these towns were just towns, right? They had their own small Jewish population since 1939. There are no ghettos in Poland yet. There are no death camps in Poland yet. So I think the Germans didn't really know what they wanted to do yet, and they just wanted to get these people out of this area. But those two towns did eventually become what were called transit ghettos. And in fact, the famous Reserve Police Battalion 101, which was so brutal in their treatment, and which the books Hitler's Willing Executioners, as well as Ordinary Men, is based on testimony from that unit. They were responsible for these two ghettos. And they were, so the population of Nasielsk was put together with 10,000 Jews from other towns in Poland. And eventually on August 25th, 1942, they were sent to Treblinka and murdered on arrival. The majority of the Nasielsk population, so of the 3,000 who were there when my grandfather visited, by the end of the war, fewer than 100 were still alive.
Okay. Can you, can you tell us about the film, which is exciting, that I guess you've collaborated with the filmmaker to make? And you want to talk about that a bit?
Sure.
And that next step. Oh, and of course it makes sense. Well, go ahead.
Okay, sure. So when the book came out in 2014, I suppose I should show you my cover, the book. This is where I have all of the research that I did and the testimonies from the survivors that I encountered and the history of the film and the town as it's displayed in the film. So when the book came out in 2014, I was contacted by a filmmaker, a Dutch film critic actually, and historian named Bianca Stichter. And she had seen the 3 minutes of footage online, and she had been invited by the Rotterdam Film Festival to create a film essay, an essay using the medium of film. And her idea was to take these 3 minutes of film, which in a sense are so heartbreaking, right? Because it's so brief. We have such a brief glimpse of these people's lives, and we know what's going to happen to them. And she had the thought to try to extend it, to take these 3 minutes and see if we could sort of draw it out by going back very much in the spirit of the book, which examines every frame, minutely to try and extract the information that's there. Because as I say, I knew nothing about it, and all the information that's there is in the footage. So I examined for every frame as carefully as I could. And she uses the camera in a very similar way to kind of zoom in and isolate details, pull out patterns, pull out individual faces, and to tell the story of the town and to some extent of Mr. Chandler as well, through that kind of an investigation of this footage. So that original film essay has now become a full-length 70-minute long documentary called 3 Minutes, a Lengthening. And it had its premiere at the Venice Film Festival in September and just showed at the Documentary Film Festival in New York City last weekend. And I believe it'll have a theatrical release in the United States in 2022.
Can I just say that premiering at Venice is really an amazing accomplishment. So congratulations about that. Were you
Thank
able to
you.
do that? Were you there?
Yes, I was there, and the story that my parents, my father and my aunt told me that it was my grandmother's hometown was actually not entirely inaccurate. It turns out that my grandparents had taken 2 trips to Europe, not only in 1938 when they visited my grandfather's hometown, but also in 1937 when they did indeed visit my grandmother's hometown, which was Berezna, at that time on the border between Poland and the Ukraine. Now it's in the Ukraine. But on that trip, they stopped in Venice. And I have a picture of my grandparents standing on the steps of the casino in the Lido from July of 1937. And as I was stepping up the steps of the casino in the Lido to go view this film at the Venice Film Festival, I just had this moment where I thought, 3 minutes of vacation footage, the extraordinary wealth of detail, the extraordinary connections, the human connections among Mr. Chandler and the other survivors and the many. It was a moment in which I just was struck once again by the awe at how much has come from these few minutes of film.
Do you want to share the trailer of the film with everyone who's here with us?
Sure.
Okay.
We're waiting for that to get queued up.
It's the clip number 4. Well, if we don't have it, why don't we just go on and people can find it online by just.
Yeah, it's on YouTube. If you search 3 Minutes, a Lengthening or 3 Minutes documentary, it'll certainly show up.
I know you want to ask me a few questions, but I have one more question for you. What
Sure.
were you doing in your life, if it's, if you can share it in a group setting, what were you doing in your life before you found this footage? How did this change your life?
Well, that's 2 different questions, but they're related, of course. The funny thing was, I had seen earlier in 2008 a presentation to commemorate the Anschluss, the German annexation of Austria in 1938. And this presentation in New York City at the Austrian Cultural Forum featured what's called an orphaned film, a piece of found film that someone had discovered in the flea market that by sort of accident happens to have historically significant seconds in it, a few seconds. And I was intrigued by this, and I started to write a novel about someone who finds an old home movie and then becomes obsessed with identifying the people who appear in it. So I was almost finished with that novel when I thought, well, you know, my family's got some old home movies. I wonder whatever happened to those. And that was why I was rooting around in my parents' closet. And then the story happened to me, and I had to throw the novel away and write the real story. So that's what I was doing in my life when I found the film. But the way that it's changed my life, I mean, it's had a profound impact on my life in so many ways. But I think maybe the most important was something I'd never, ever imagined. When I found the footage and I looked at it for the first time, what I thought that I had in my hands was a memorial. I thought what I had was something that would allow us to remember people who had been killed. And it is, of course, that. There's no question. And I think in some sense, that's the sort of burden of the film, is to serve as that memorial. What I had never imagined, and what has really been life-changing for me as I've moved forward from that time, I had never imagined that it would also become this sort of nexus of a living community, that it would connect me with these survivors, with their families, with families of other survivors who were no longer living, with descendants like me who had left, you know, whose ancestors had left before the war. And then not only with them and their memories and the extraordinary ways in which, you know, the few fragments that people happened to preserve, you know, a photograph here or a letter there, began to connect up in this almost magical way, so that, you know, pieces would be scattered all over the world. And it was just because I was going around asking for it that it became possible to connect them. Sort of that kind of human connection became possible. And then subsequently as well, that in the town of Nasielsk, which of course still exists today, and is a lovely community, where the impact of this film has been tremendous as well, from a place where the Jewish heritage, while known, was, you know, very much in the background. It is now beginning to embrace this. People in the town are, of course, very excited that the film exists, and that, you know, now it's being shown in theaters around the world. Just this past week, a mural was unveiled to commemorate a factory, a button factory actually, that was owned by a Jewish owner, the Filar family, and was a sort of the economic engine at the center of town for many years before the war. They've commemorated that. There's an educational program now going on in the K through 12 system to study Jewish history in coordination with the Polin Museum and other organizations in Poland. So just the idea that this film would go out and change living people's lives and provide a kind of connection and a kind of home for all of these isolated and scattered fragments, that was something I'd never expected, and that's really changed my life.
Wonderful answer. So I'm going to hand it over to you after I make this statement. And the statement is, however corny, that on behalf of the 3,000 Jewish residents of that town, a great debt of gratitude is owed to you for helping to bring them back to life.
Thank you. That's very moving. Now I can't even talk to ask you a question. Thank you. It's an honor to be talking with you. I have seen so many of your films and have really been grateful for them. And maybe I'd ask just about the most recent, Who Will Write Our History, which, yeah, I think just tells such an extraordinary story. One of the questions I have for you is, someone like Emanuel Ringelblum, the role that he played is so historically important, and his personnel sensibility seems to have been so accepting in an odd way, and open, right? The whole idea of what he wanted to gather, he was very ahead of his time in terms of his historiography. He collected, you know, ticket stubs and restaurant menus and all sorts of things that wouldn't be recognized until later as historically valuable. I wanted to ask you, when you approached telling his story, how did you feel about the responsibility to do honor to both the historical importance of what he had done, but also the man himself?
Well, I would extend that. I'll tell you that it was a very heavy burden, one willingly and taken on, and one that I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to engage with. The first person that I owed my biggest sense of responsibility was to Sam Kassow, who wrote the book Who Will Write Our History, and spent 10, 12 years of his life writing that book, researching, bringing Ringelblum and the other members of the Onyx Shabbos to life within the pages of his book. I would have never even known about Emanuel Ringelblum if it hadn't been for Sam. And Sam was so generous with me in terms of, we worked together for, I don't know, I worked on the film for 8 years. So I believe that, the beginning of that was meeting Sam, and he was so generous. I mean, you now as an author working with a filmmaker know, that the book is your baby, and then you have to kind of let go a bit. And Sam was always really, really generous with his knowledge and encouragement. Even when I was at the beginning of the process and knew nothing, he was, I guess he's a good teacher. But he wasn't overbearing. He understood that there was a difference between a book and a film. And we both I agonized in terms of responsibility to Ringelblum and the others. The biggest agony for me is I didn't just have 3 minutes. I had something like 60,000 pages of documents that they collected, was what to leave out. And I hope I'm wrong, but I didn't think there was going to be another major film on the Onyx Shabbos archive in the near term. And so I felt the sense of responsibility that whatever member of the Onyx Shabbos archive or piece of writing got left out of the film was going to remain buried to a certain extent. But the greater charge was to tell the story in a way that would be compelling enough that people would watch it. And the greatest thing for me, I realized, I don't know, 1 or 2 screenings in when the film was done, was that, the members of the Onyx Shabbos archive wanted two things, really. They wanted to have the story of the Jewish experience during the war told from Jewish sources and the Jewish point of view, not from the point of view who hated them enough to, murder them. Seems fair enough. And then the other thing that they wanted was to be remembered as individuals. And I realized when I was showing the film to audiences that people watching the film were actively honoring both of those wishes of the members of the Onyx Shabbos archive. So that was a tremendous feeling. And of course, I could never do justice to who they were and what they did, but it's a start.
Yeah, I really relate to that agonizing over what to leave out, because everything feels so important. And of course, just in writing the book, I had that same problem there. Every word that the survivors said felt important to me. And
right, exactly.
Paraphrased by, already felt like somehow dishonoring. So maybe I'll ask a final question, because since I see Elise is here, and we should probably move on to the Q&A. But, it's very much that question. A film is a paraphrase in some sense. And I guess I'm in documenting the documenters. There's always this tension between telling a story and presenting the history. History doesn't happen as a story. A film, however, has to happen as a story. A book has to happen as a story. And I'm curious actually about how you approached that tension between, I don't know if I want to call it accuracy exactly, but the sort of pure documentary dimension and then the narrative dimension of the film itself.
Well, I'd have to say that accuracy, historical accuracy, was paramount, because if people felt the film wasn't accurate, interest would just wane or turn off immediately. So, and also out of respect for Ringelblum and the other members of the archive and of Sam, accuracy was paramount. But after that, the story was paramount. because I wanted people to watch the film and come to know and love Ringo Bloom and Auerbach and the others. And the only way to do that is to tell a compelling story. So anything that didn't fit, and each character had an arc, just like a dramatic film. Anything that did not move that story forward, of those stories forward, had to be jettisoned, sadly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to talk to you. Okay.
Likewise, thank you.
I'm sorry to interrupt this incredibly fascinating and provocative conversation between the two of you. You're raising so many compelling issues, and we will get back to them. But we wanted to take a few minutes before we entertain some of the questions that have been shared in the comment section to show the film.
Okay.
So let's go there, and then we'll come back.
Thanks, Liz. That's great.
Thank you.
These 3 minutes of life were taken out of the flow of time by David Kurtz in 1938.
Nasielsk was not an important town unless you lived there. It was just a town. But of all the Polish towns destroyed in the Holocaust, Nasielsk is among the very few that exist in moving pictures, among just a handful preserved in color.
I recognized myself immediately. Nobody had cameras like that. It was like a novelty. It was like a magic moment.
The fact that a camera recorded them is evidence that these people really have existed.
All I could do was to piece together the few fragments of their lives that remained, to show their edges and absences, defining the loss of that world by detailing the little of it that had been preserved.
I'm glad we could share that. We hope that many will see this extraordinary film, The Lengthening of a 3-Minute Story, which you've already lengthened through your conversations and taken us in so many directions. Let's take some questions.
And buy the book.
Of course. Please, Glenn, let everyone know, please do. Please watch Who Will Write Our History. These are two extraordinary resources which bring our past to life and bring us to the present. So let's take a few questions. There are too many to take all of them, and I hope our participants, our audience understands. But let's take the first one, and I open the floor to both of you.
Is somebody going to read the questions to us?
Yes, let me.
I don't see them.
The first question is from Lori Russman. I didn't realize that trips back to Poland were happening at that time. Why go back? I would love to hear anecdotes.
I'll leave that to you, Glenn.
Sure. It's. I think we all have this idea that, you emigrated and that was it. You never, you severed contact. Right. Maybe you wrote letters back to the old country. But in fact, people did go back and forth. Right. And it's not entirely unheard of that people would emigrate and then decide, the U.S. wasn't for them, and then they would return to Europe. Mm. But there was actually a travel agency that specialized in what we would today call, heritage tours. That is to say, people who were going back to visit their right. folks in the old country after having emigrated in the usually pre-World War I period, and then in the interwar period, they would go back at some point. So it wasn't entirely uncommon, and it wasn't so expensive that it was out of the reach of lower middle class to middle class people. It was something that was possible for people to do. And
it was also a way for people to show, like, hey, Ma, I've done good. Look at my, my family. Look how nicely my wife is dressed. Look at my fancy new movie camera. So there's
absolutely.
It's family, so it's always complicated layers.
Yeah, and I mean, on some level, I think my grandparents' trip was kind of a victory lap, right? Like they went back to show the people, like, we did it. We became Americans, and we became successful Americans.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Our second question is, what suggestions can you both give to those who are ready to unpack those boxes in the family attic?
Do it now. And ask every question you can think of the people who can still remember, or even the people who put the boxes away if they don't know, and document it. Get it on tape, get it on video, get it somehow. Because it goes away so fast. I often say one of the first things that gets lost in families is the names of the previous generation. You know, you'll remember the food that your great-grandmother made, you know, 3 generations down, but you won't know the names of her siblings. You won't know the names of your cousins, even in the generation before. Because why? Because they're so familiar. Why would you write on the back of a photograph, oh, this is, you know, Aunt Shirley? True. Right? I know it's Aunt Shirley. I mean, how could you not know that it's Aunt Shirley? And yet, you know, your children or your grandchildren are like, well, that's like some kind of a cousin or something. I don't know. It gets lost immediately. So, yeah, do it, and do it now, and do it thoroughly.
So, all too true for all of us, and thank you for that suggestion. Roberta, would you like to speak to that?
No, I think that Glenn did a great job. Let's go to the next question.
Okay, so Christina Lagovitsk writes, I've been fascinated by interwar Poland. Any resources you can recommend?
Oh boy, there's so many resources. I would start with current day Poland, with the Polin Museum, which doesn't trace just the interwar period, but traces, you know, 1,000 years of the history of Jews in Poland, of Polish Jews. I really tried very hard in my film, Who Will Write Our History, to show the life that was between the war. And you're right to be interested in it, because it was probably one of the most culturally vibrant periods in all of Jewish history. The interwar period, especially in Warsaw alone, was a universe with, you know, dozens and dozens of newspapers in Hebrew, in Polish, and in Yiddish, entire school systems, literary clubs. I mean, you know, the intense political activity, and everybody grappling with, you know, what the solution to forgive the expression, the Jewish problem. Should we stay? Should we go? Where should we go? Is our solution particular, as in Zionism, or is our solution general, as in socialism or communism? The period in between the war is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would only add, just from the microcosm, that in Nasielsk, you know, when people think, oh, a shtetl, I try not to use that word, because it conjures, you know, Anatevka or some kind of, you know, 19th century or late 18th century town. But this was a town on the cusp of modernity. You know, people had telephones, people had electricity, there was a cinema in town, people had cars. You know, it wasn't the backwards place that we often imagine. And as a result, just as Roberta said, there's this tremendous cultural vibrancy. They were aware of the world. They were participating in the wider political world. And, you know, in Nasielsk, there were amateur theater clubs. There were also, you know, local newspapers.
And yet, you know, when you see pictures, family pictures from this period, you see often, like, the grandparents are dressed very traditionally, as if they just stepped out of Anatevka. You know, maybe the next generation is has some blending, and then the younger generation is completely modern. So you see in a single family photograph this transition that was occurring. And so people who were becoming very, very secular and very modern, they knew the sources, right? They were deeply, deeply rooted in Jewish tradition. So it's a very fertile period.
And it's visible even in the film, right? You see the little girls, they have the Louise Brooks bob, right? I mean, they're fashionable haircuts, you know?
So as a way to close our incredible session, let's open the floor to you, Glenn and Roberta, for one final send-off comment that will take us further.
Gosh,
Roberta?
That's the curveball we weren't expecting.
I guess I remain very committed to exploring Jewish history, and it's not always popular as a filmmaker, as a documentary filmmaker. Most documentary filmmakers are interested in contemporary issues, and thank God that they are. They're really some of the most profound journalists and truth tellers of our day. I find for myself personally that there's no end of amazing and fascinating, profound, and relevant stories to be explored in Jewish history. And one of the reasons, so I've continued to do that in my own filmmaking. I also recently, with Caroline Labresco, who's a producer and a programmer who was a lead programmer at Sundance for the last 19 years, started something called Jewish Story Partners. And we're basically aggregating money from funders and giving grants to filmmakers wishing to tell a Jewish story. So anybody, right now we're only funding films from the U.S. documentary features. We will expand hopefully as time goes on. If anybody's interested and has a story to tell, please look at jewishstorypartners.org and see if there's something that we can do to help you.
Thank you, Roberta. Glenn?
Wow. Well, so what I'll add is only two things. That we first are, of course, living in a moment of transition. The survivor generation and the witness generation is passing away rapidly. And so it's going to be very soon within our immediate lifetimes that we are the holders of this history, and that it's our responsibility to remember it and to investigate it, right? And to understand its complexity, because there's a great tendency, especially in the aftermath of a trauma, in the survivor community, and I mean the surviving Jewish community, to simplify what happened. And yet it is the complexity that makes it living and makes it worth understanding. So I urge that responsibility on anyone who is thinking of engaging with that history. And that leads to the second point, which is the relations between the Jewish descendants of Polish Jews and the Poles who live in Poland today. At least I know it's something that you engage with every single day. But that, I think, is a flashpoint and a hotspot, and also perhaps the most interesting place at the moment to really engage with what is happening. And I know that it's a fraught question in Poland, but I think it's an equally fraught question, at least emotionally, if not legally, for people in the United States or elsewhere in the world. How do we understand our place in that history, and how do we understand our relation to the people who live in those towns now? And I've spent 10 years now going back to Nasielsk and trying to meet people and trying to interest people and encourage interest among those who already expressed it, in recognizing that the Jewish history that took place in this town is also Polish history, and that the Polish history is also the Jewish history, right? So I think that this is an area that requires now a great deal of sensitivity and attention.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Roberta. You have shared incredible insights, and your experiences and your perspectives are most welcome. You're leaving us much food for thought, not only in our own attics, but in communal spaces as well. And we thank you very much for joining us. Dear participants, thank you as well for joining us this evening or this morning, wherever you might be. And if you'd like to support this program, you will find some information about it in a follow-up email. I want to also thank, of course, our TJHTalks team, Kaya and Kuba, and we look forward to seeing all of you at our next session on December 8th. In the meantime, please stay well and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Roberta. Thank you.